One afternoon, a shiny sphere would appear overhead at a Polish airport owned by one of the largest airplane manufacturers in the country. One of the most famous aviators in Poland's history was one of the many that witnessed this strange object hovering above. This man had flown thousands of hours, received a degree in airplane engineering, and was even the youngest man in the country to have ever had a professional and tourist aircraft license, as well as the youngest to ever be a flight instructor. After being prompted by several other employees, this pilot, Henrik Bronovitzky, would even take off in his plane after it. Although many thought the object was a balloon at first, Henrik would strongly disagree. What he saw that day would leave a mark in his memory, and he would stick by his story for the rest of his life. To get the whole picture of the story, it's important to know more about the history of the man who encountered this strange metal sphere to begin with. Henrik Bronovitzky was born on February 9, 1948 in Kaslo, and this is where he would spend the first 10 years of his life. In 1959, he and his family moved to the industrial city of Mielec in the southeastern region of Poland. Although this town had a population of less than 50,000, it was still home to several craft, IT, and technical schools, as well as one of the largest airplane manufacturers in Eastern Europe. And this is where Henrik would first become interested in planes, beginning to construct models of them while still in primary school. As soon as he was 18, he joined the local Mielec Aero Club and began to train in flying small gliders. The next year, he started going to a mechanical technical school while also starting work in technical controls at WSK PZL, Mielec, one of the largest aircraft assembly plants in Poland. In 1968, Henrik would obtain a glider pilot license and soon after earned a diamond for the Golden Glider Badge from the World Sports Organization. And this was after he made a 320-kilometer or 200-mile flight in a standard glider. That same year, he would complete his flight training on the LWD Janok airplane at a nearby airport, which allowed him to fly smaller aircraft. After about 2 years and 1,000 flight hours, he pretty quickly gained a professional license as well as a tourist aircraft pilot license. Henrik, only 22 at this time, was officially the youngest person in Poland to ever have these qualifications. Within just 1 year, he was approached and given a job as a flight instructor, where he would train candidates for the Higher Aviation School in Dublin. This achievement would also make him the youngest aviation instructor in the history of Poland. That same year, he would be promoted, now working in the technical control department of the final assembly of airplanes. Henrik would also transport planes as well, and at one point that year, he would even go out to Nigeria where he performed geophysical flights in an AN-2 airplane. He would also train in parachuting, performing 14 jumps and becoming a third-class parachute jumper. In 1972, after 2 years in final assembly, he would again be promoted, now given the job of performing flight tests and research. During this time, he also began to undergo theoretical and practical training, and in 1974 he would pass an exam, giving him the Test Pilot Class 2 license. At the age of 26, Henrik would be promoted to test pilot at the same aircraft assembly plant he had started at just 8 years prior. This would be around the time that he would begin his engineering studies at the Rzeszów University of Technology, where he specialized in aircraft construction. He would also begin his training on multi-engine aircraft as well as testing the prototype of the M18 Dromader. He did this by performing agricultural flights, spraying cotton plants in Egypt. In 1979, he passed the state theoretical exams as well as the practical exam, who was actually observed by Zeta-Files Blanowic, a legend of Polish sports and experimental aviation, qualifying him for the Test Pilot Class 1 license. From this point onward, Bronovitzky would be able to fly prototype planes as well as submit his opinion on prototype tests for the State Aviation Supervision Authority. Following this, he would be sent around Europe, from Great Britain to Moscow, participating in air shows and various other exhibitions that would show off the new M18 Dromader and the M20 Miva. In 1981, he would even fly a newly assembled AN-2 airplane to Vietnam, where he would train a group of pilots on how to work these machines. In 1983, he would become the pilot as well as the head of the first experimental firefighting airbase in Poland. Here he would develop several publications on aerial firefighting, including safety rules, radio communications, training programs, and specific instructions for using the M18 Dromader in extinguishing forest fires. The next year, as part of a deal with Germany, Henrik would make 895 flights in just 45 days. This would be during the transportation of multiple M18s, as well as flights meant to train the German pilots on how to use the aircraft. After this, he would begin even more training in order to be able to fly even more different types of aircraft. And this would all be done at the Mielec airport, which was owned by the same company, PZL, that had employed Henrik his entire adult life. And this is where our story takes place, in 1984, out on this Mielec airfield, which was built just before the outbreak of World War II. This airport was on the smaller side and was mainly used for testing new airplanes made by PZL. It had 2 hangars and just enough lodging for some staff, 2 military pilots, and a few test pilots. It's here that Henrik would be working on and off, flying and testing different TS-11 Iskra, a jet plane that would be used for over 50 years as a trainer for the Polish Air Force. He'd been performing a number of flights with this craft, fixing malfunctions and making sure everything was working properly before he would eventually sign off on it, saying that the aircraft was suitable for operation. Now it was July 13th, 1984, in the early afternoon. It had been 2 days since one of these flights, and he was on his way back to the airfield to see if the mechanics had fixed the problems with the plane that he had noticed before. Henrik would park and get out of his car at about 4:30 p.m., thinking that it was just any other day. But he soon looked over to see a couple of mechanics as well as some other employees standing in front of the hangars, looking to be excitedly discussing something while looking up into the sky. He looked up himself, later stating, "What I saw myself somewhat surprised me. There was an object in the shape of a silvery sphere above the airfield, and it wasn't moving despite the wind blowing about 5 meters a second. If it had been any kind of balloon, it would have drifted with the wind." They all stood and simply watched the object hover in place for a while. Soon, some of them would go over the telemeter and observe the craft for another 40 minutes or so. This was a powerful mounted set of binoculars on a portable stand that was normally used to view the condition of landing gear. Using this, they determined that the craft must be at an altitude of at least 2,000 meters, or about 6,500 feet. It seems that the radar operators couldn't see this object, but just in case, they decided to suspend all flights around that air corridor. They would even get in contact with the military radar controls in Samdomyish, about 70 kilometers away, which had some of the very most high-tech equipment in the country, but they were unable to detect anything either. After several people told Henrik he needed to go up there and check it out, he decided to do just that. Normally, he was allowed to fly his plane up to 2,400 meters without needing to jump through any extra hoops. But since this sphere was in the upper limits of this, he decided to go ahead and get permission to go up to 5,000 meters in altitude. The flight director on duty, Kazimir Lubatovics, would first look at the data provided by the instruments, showing 6/8 cloud cover and a cloud base of 1,800 meters, visibility of 20 kilometers, wind blowing at 270 degrees with a speed about 5 meters a second. All this meant that the weather that day was actually ideal for flying. By 6 p.m., after Henrik had consulted with a number of people, he was finally given the permission to fly up close to this strange silver sphere. As Bronovitzky was getting the plane ready, a well-liked older gentleman from technical inspection, Henrik Libera, would decide to hop in as an observer during this flight. Just after takeoff, the two were informed that the object seemed to be moving towards the northern border of their airspace, and may be heading towards the nearby Deba military training ground. This training ground very often performed a number of different Polish and international exercises, and this was an issue because that training ground was said to be operating up to 10,000 meters at that time. So if they weren't careful and accidentally flew over Deba, they could unintentionally be shot down by artillery shells. Henrik Bronovitzky had even seen some of these artillery test firings and said that it wasn't unusual for some of the shells to land dozens of kilometers away from the planned area, and this of course worried him quite a bit. At this point, the two Henriks were at an altitude of about 2,000 meters above the airfield. It was around now that the military base, Samdomyish, would radio him saying that they could see him on their radar and would continue to track him. But when Henrik asked if they could see the silver sphere on their radar screens, they simply told him that they could not. He would then communicate with the Mielec airfield again, getting the go-ahead to fly towards the object, which seemingly hadn't moved much from its original position. After just a couple of moments, the two would be within just 500 meters, but now it seemed that the sphere had elevated to about 2,500 meters, and was above them. They could now see just how large it actually was. The two would quickly agree that it was at least 25 meters or 82 feet in diameter. They concluded that this was no balloon either. Instead, this strange object seemed to be rotating around a vertical axis. The flight director from the airfield down below would then radio Henrik, saying, "We can see the aircraft and the balloon. We're observing you through the telemeter all the time." I have telephone communication with the radar operator from Samdomyesh who confirmed that he only sees your aircraft on his radar. He doesn't see the balloon. The director then told them that it was okay to go ahead and fly closer to the object and told them that they would keep observing. Henrik then said that he would stay in contact with them and started to gain altitude and speed off towards the silver spinning sphere. He was doing this with the intention of flying very close by it to see if he could get a reaction or at least get a glance of it up close. But again, as they got within 500 meters of this object, it began to rise and fly away. But this time though, Henrik was more prepared. He shifted his plane and rose with the object, separating them by only about 100 meters. Now that the two men were closer, they almost immediately became overtaken by fascination with this object. Up close, they could see the beautiful silver shimmering surface of the object which gently reflected the sunlight back at them. The sphere was also quite large, at least twice as big as the plane, and seemed to be constantly rotating along its axis at a fairly high speed. It also didn't quite appear to be a perfect sphere either. From this distance, it looked to be slightly elongated vertically. It also looked to have a small color difference towards the bottom, which appeared just a bit darker. As they continued to gain altitude, they also started to lose a bit of speed, which is to be expected. But what was strange is that the silver sphere seemed to match their speed, staying a consistent 100 meters away from them at the very minimum. As they didn't plan on going above 5,000 meters, they didn't even have on their oxygen masks. But as they flew higher, they realized that they would have to pull them out quite quickly. Now the two were nearly 6,000 meters up in the air, and the object continued to rise above them. Bronovitzky said, "When I was directly below it, I noticed a dark spot. It looked like some kind of dark container was suspended. The balloon had an elongated shape and was moving around its axis. It is difficult for me to say what it was, but it was certainly not a weather balloon. Of course, I do not suppose it was a UFO either." After a few more minutes, they had reached an altitude of 7,500 meters, or nearly 25,000 feet, and the silver sphere would just not allow them to get any closer than 100 meters away. That's when they would report back to the flight director, saying that they were aborting the task and were preparing to come in for a landing. And extraordinarily, even though they couldn't see it from their plane, as they started to descend, the object began to descend too. The director would radio them back, saying, "The object is following you, descending together with you." By the time they were about to land, it was back in its original position. In a final attempt, Henrik pulled the plane around and tried to fly by it one more time, but again, it unfortunately started to fly away. Giving up for good, they decided to just go ahead and land back on the airfield. Soon after, while taxiing to the parking position, the director would radio them again, telling them that the strange craft was right back in the position it had started in before their takeoff. Exiting the airplane, the two men rejoined their co-workers who were back to observing the bizarre object. They would be told that they continued to study it from the ground during their flight, and it was determined that the object must have been bigger than 11 meters in diameter, but that was about all they had really established. After about 20 minutes, the object suddenly began to fly off at a very high speed in the southwestern direction. Soon afterwards, he would tell local reporters, "The phenomenon was strange, incomprehensible, and downright extraordinary," which is why together with observer Henrik Libera we confirmed, mutually reassuring each other, our observations and perceptions. Not only did Henrik and the other employees see this object, but many people in the surrounding towns would see something strange as well. In fact, many reports would come in on this day and be published throughout the following weeks. At 7:40 that same night, one family in Mielec were in their garden tending to their plants like they did on many other days. But then the mother's attention was drawn to something resembling a soap bubble in the sky, seeming to reflect the rays of the setting sun. He was completely motionless, even though there was quite a bit of strong wind. She would say, "Our suspicions were limited to stating that it was a weather balloon, but my 8-year-old son, fascinated by the ball, threw in our direction, 'That's a UFO.'" The parents smiled at what the child had said and went back to what they were doing. But after the object hovered in place for well over half an hour, the two parents began to really wonder if it was possible for a weather balloon to stay so still in the increasingly strong winds. After a bit longer, they would conclude that it had actually started to move a bit, but it was actually moving perpendicular to the wind's direction. They would even see a passenger plane fly well below the soap bubble object, giving them an idea of just how large and far away it must have been. They would claim that the other residents in their housing estate would continue watching the sphere all the way up to 10:30 that night before it became too cloudy to view anymore. Other nearby towns would have plenty of reports flooding in as well. One resident of Rzeszów, Stanislaw R., would tell the media, "At first I thought it was some ordinary balloon. However, when I began to look at it more carefully, I was struck by the fact that the clouds were flowing across the sky, but it hung motionless in one place, as if attached. And it was somehow gleaming strangely in the sun." This object was also noticed by the airfield ground services, with air traffic controllers at Rzeszów Airport, Janos' point, stating, "It was like a sphere from which bright light was reflected. It could have been at an altitude of approximately 2,000 meters and had a diameter of several meters." He would go on to say that this object looked to be flying against the wind towards Mielec. 50 kilometers away in Mielec, the airfield would see the flying object to the south of them, with it appearing to still be moving westwards. One employee of the airfield, A. Vlajan, would comment on this, saying, "So far, we're racking our brains about what could have been above our heads on July 13th. It seems that others had seen something similar as well, but some claim that they appeared to be much smaller, more the size of a coin." Just half an hour before Henrik had arrived at the airport that day, two men who both happened to live in the same housing estate would witness a very similar object. These men, a Nizj an employee at the customs office, and Izij A.S., a worker at the district prosecution's office, were both on their way home from work that same day, July 13th. They were near the housing estate when, almost straight above their heads, they would notice something resembling a ball or coin hovering motionless in the sky. The object almost seemed to radiate a light similar to sunlight, but was almost white in color. They stood and watched it for nearly 3 minutes before it disappeared in an instant, leaving no trace at all. Others would manage to see the same or similar object near Kanjuga as well. One man was observing some construction taking place when he and many of the workers would notice a strange craft in the sky. This man would tell the press, "The object was in one place for so long that the foreman sent one of their workers home to get a telescope. Everyone managed to take a good look and then went back to work." It seems that he even heard the foreman say that it was just a balloon wrapped in tape. This was something that the man strongly disagreed with, stating, "A balloon? So why was it in place for so long? I know that from publications, it looked as if it was narrowing, and the upper part was smaller. If it was a balloon, the larger part with gas, example helium, lighter than air, should have been at the top. Nobody noticed when, how, and in which direction it flew away either." In another small town, Aeronitska, it was said that thousands witnessed a very similar flying craft too. Others have been able to observe it using a telescope as well from the balcony of their home. One of these witnesses would describe the craft to the media, saying that it was shiny, elongated, and had a dark spot on the underside, which appeared to move around. The group would continue to watch it for about 15 minutes before the object was covered by heavy clouds. And there would be one more report from this town, although it was made public much later on. One man who remembered seeing this object as a child would come forward in the early 2000s, stating, "It so happens that I was also able to observe this object directly, and by complete accident. Even though I was only 8 years old at the time, I remember this event like it was yesterday." On the afternoon of July 13th, the same day as the other sightings, this boy was picking mushrooms with his parents at the edge of the village. When they finished up, they started to walk back towards the car when they would come to see something strange through a gap in the trees. A bizarre, shiny, round object hanging motionless. They weren't sure how large it actually was, but from their point of view it was as large as the quarter moon. They stood and watched for around 3 minutes before the object moved away and was obscured by the trees. His father would tell him that it was probably just some kind of balloon. One witness would even see it in 2 different towns on the same day. This man had noticed the same strange object hovering up in the sky late in the afternoon while waiting for the bus in Wiesnawa. Not thinking too much of it, he hopped on the bus and rode all the way out to Rochitsa. After getting off, out of curiosity, he looked back up in the sky and was surprised to see that the bizarre object was still hovering there. It may have been moving slowly to the north, but it was really hard for him to be sure. This gave the impression that the object must be quite large, since the man could see it from both towns that were over 14 kilometers away from each other. This report would come in around 6 p.m., which leads many to speculate that there may have been more than one object hovering over the area that day. Others speculate that after the object left the Mielitz airfield, it must have flown towards Tarnow, where it would again be seen around 10:15 p.m. The first report would state that it appeared suddenly and reflected a bright light, also adding that it was about the same size as the sun in the sky and looked to be surrounded by a bright halo. One man, a Mr. Polsky in the city, would write about it a few days afterwards, stating, "For several dozen minutes, hundreds of people saw a brightly shining ball the size of the sun hanging motionless in the northern part of the sky." It seems that he and many other witnesses would watch it in the sky for a moment before it suddenly took off and disappeared over the horizon at an incredible speed. In this writing, he would also claim that this sighting caused a lot of commotion in the local area, with a resident in Nove Mesto saying, "It could have been 2 or 3 meters in diameter. It perfectly reflected the sunlight, as if it were polished or covered with silver. It didn't arouse any great emotions in me. I'm convinced it was an ordinary meteorological balloon." However, many did believe that it was only a balloon. The press in Tarnow were quick to make their own suggestions on this topic. They said that all of the sightings could be of a spy balloon carrying propaganda leaflets or of a weather probe that wandered off course from a neighboring country. And the local papers would then even claim that the whole mystery was solved thanks to a Tarnow resident. This man happened to find a large weather probe attached to a balloon hanging on a tree. The report read, "The probe was probably sent from the territory of Czechoslovakia and wandered into the Tarnow area. It is an extremely rare case for a probe of this type to wander into this region." But after this explanation was given, many were quick to point out that reports contradicted each other. How could the flying object fly over the horizon at an incredible speed while also somehow falling to the ground in the same town? This all leads many to believe that this was all some kind of smokescreen to cover up the true facts from that day. Although it wasn't found till around 2004, one report from the Mielitz area stated that after the flying object disappeared, 2 MiG-29s would appear and fly over the city as well. But others aren't so sure how true this report really is. Some question why the UFO wasn't shot down if it had really been hovering in place in so many different locations. And one other fact people are quick to point out is how strong the wind actually was that day. Almost as soon as the sightings had ended, it started to storm all over the area. There were even reports of a tornado causing destruction in a nearby city just 4 days later. So how could a balloon stay so motionless right before the storms came rolling through? Although it seems that these balloon-like objects had been witnessed by hundreds or even thousands of people, no formal investigation was ever performed. The news of this sighting even seemed to have reached several ufologists at that time, but for whatever reason, none ever even attempted to research the topic. It seems that in the end, the most valuable information still comes from Henrik Bronovitzky, who by far came closest to the silver sphere in the sky. Based on his report and the description of how it moved next to their airplane, it just seems that there is almost no possibility that this object was a weather balloon or any other device known to Poland at that time. If anything, the most impressive part of this case is just how reliable of a witness Henrik Bronovitzky really was. He was, and still is, quite famous for everything he's accomplished over the years. He had flown over 488 newly produced aircraft, done numerous tests and prototypes, and even performed some of the riskiest test flights around. It seems that he even had several air accidents in his career, but never even suffered any injuries from them. In total, Henrik would fly over 9,560 hours on more than 14,000 flights, and was even a flight commander on 56 different airplanes. Years later, after the fall of communism, the factory Henrik was working at began to suffer financially due to the large decline in orders. Henrik seemed to eventually move on as well, changing jobs and becoming a commercial air pilot in Warsaw in 1997. After just 2 years, he was promoted to captain and remained in that position until he retired in 2004 at the age of 56. He would go on to publish his memoirs in 2014 called in English, Experimental Pilot. In this book, he explains many of his stories in a very real way, sharing private conversations and other details that help piece together Polish aviation history. After accomplishing this much in his life, it just doesn't seem like he would have any reason to lie about a UFO sighting, as it didn't really get him any more attention than he already had. In reality, it was only one short chapter in his entire book, and was even called, "Was It a UFO?" Even now, at the age of 77, Henrik continues to stand by what he said many years prior, and was quite sure that this was no balloon, saying, "I am not a specialist in UFOs and such phenomena, but what I saw raised many questions that, as an aeronautical engineer and test pilot, I cannot answer." And a big thanks goes out to my current Patreon member, who also helped translate this material and made this video possible, Jarek Hadrowski. Please be sure to like and subscribe too. Also consider joining my Patreon or channel membership where you can get these videos early and ad-free. This show is also available on most podcast platforms, so be sure to check it out if you'd rather hear it than watch it. Thanks again for watching, everyone. This was Matt, and I want to believe.